I was scrolling through Facebook on a slow Thursday morning when the first photo stopped my heart. A pristine, oceanfront view, white chairs, and string lights, woven through birch trees at our family estate in Kennebunkport, Maine. It was a $150,000 wedding. I blinked, refreshing the screen, as 200 guests loaded every neighbor and cousin I've ever known except me. Smack in the center was my brother, Tyler, grinning beside Destiny, my ex-friend, who spent years trying to be me. The realization hit with a clinical, freezing clarity. I wasn't just forgotten, I was erased. Have you ever discovered a massive secret about your family through a social media post? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't throw my phone. I didn't scream. The rage wasn't loud. It was clinical. I simply walked into my home office and sat in front of my 3-monitor setup. The high-performance architectural workstation hummed to life, and the cold blue light reflecting off my glasses felt more like a weapon than a tool. I've spent my entire career designing spaces that provide security and structure, but right now, I was looking for the cracks in my own foundation. My family didn't just forget to invite me to an oceanfront wedding. They had committed a hostile takeover of my life while I was busy footing the bill. For 5 years, I'd managed the family limited liability company for free. Every tax filing, every maintenance contract for the Kennebunkport estate, every insurance renewal, it all went through my hands. I'd been the silent investor in their narrative of a perfect, wealthy family. I treated it as an obligation of love. But staring at those photos of Tyler and Destiny, I realized it had actually been a high-interest loan that they never intended to repay. Destiny, who had spent our friendship copying my designs and leeching off my connections, was now standing on my porch in a dress that probably cost $10,000. I accessed the encrypted cloud drive, where I kept the trust documents. I didn't need to search. I knew exactly where grandmother's original will was. I scrolled through the legalese until I found the specific clause regarding the Kennebunkport property. It was willed to me solely and completely upon my 30th birthday, which had passed 2 years ago. The house, currently valued at nearly $2 million, was legally mine. My parents had convinced me to keep it in the company name for tax purposes, and I trusted them, because that's what you do when you're under the illusion of belonging. I looked at the photos again. The white chairs were set up on the lawn, where I used to study. The dance floor was built over the flower beds I'd paid to have replanted last spring. They were throwing a 6-figure celebration for the brother who couldn't even keep a job for 6 months, using the estate I legally owned, and they hadn't even bothered to send a text. This wasn't a family dynamic anymore. It was an unauthorized usage of a primary asset. I picked up the phone and dialed my bank's private wealth division. It was nearly 11 in the morning. When my advisor answered, my voice didn't shake. It was as steady as a structural blueprint. I told him to flag the Kennebunkport property as a disputed asset and demanded a full ledger of every trust withdrawal over the last 24 months. I wanted a complete freeze on any transactions related to the family limited liability company. This wasn't revenge. It was an accounting of a massive emotional and financial deficit. By the time I hung up, the sun was hitting the coast of Maine. But inside my office, it was the coldest winter I'd ever known. The wind off the Atlantic doesn't just blow. It bites. It's a dry, salt-crusted cold that reminds you exactly where you stand in the world. As I sat in my office, the memory of that same wind from 2 winters ago came back, sharp enough to cut. I remembered standing on the porch of the Kennebunkport house, watching Tyler's car disappear into the gray mist after I'd handed him a check for $45,000. It was his gambling debt, though he called it a misunderstanding with investors. I hadn't even hesitated then. I was the architect, the high earner, the one who had it all together. My mother, Jennifer, had placed her hand on my arm, the same arm she probably used to toast Tyler and Destiny last Saturday, and told me I was so strong. She said Tyler was fragile and emotional, but that I was the foundation of the family. At the time, I took it as a compliment. I wore my resilience like a badge of honor. Now, I see it for what it was, a label designed to keep me quiet, while they bled me dry. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and I was the fool who kept approving the transactions. I realized then that I had been living in a prison without bars. It was a cage, made of my own silence and their expectations. This is the invisible chain of the survivor. When you are the one who always figures it out, the one who never complains, you eventually become invisible. Your needs aren't just secondary. They don't exist. My family hadn't spent 30 years loving me. They'd spent 30 years normalizing my exploitation. I was never a daughter to them. I was a resource, a high-yield savings account they could withdraw from whenever Tyler made another fragile mistake. Every time I'd mentioned a career milestone or a major contract I'd won, Jennifer would shush me. She'd say we shouldn't brag because it might make Tyler feel insecure. I had spent a lifetime shrinking myself, pulling my own structural supports inward, just so my brother could feel like the tallest building in the room. I had been the scaffolding for a monument that wasn't even mine. Staring at the blue screen of my workstation, I could almost hear my mother's voice, echoing through the salt spray wind. "You don't need us, Victoria. You're so strong." The truth is, I wasn't strong. I was just well-trained. I was a survivor who had learned that the only way to avoid the freezing wind of their disapproval was to keep the lights on for everyone else, while I sat in the dark. But that Thursday morning, as I looked at the 3-tier cake and the forest green dress, the chains finally snapped. I wasn't looking for an apology anymore. I was looking at a balance sheet that had been in the red for 3 decades. The wind outside was still howling, but for the first time, I wasn't the one trying to block the draft. I was the one opening the door to let the winter in. 4 days after the oceanfront wedding, the first vibration from my father, Thomas, hit the desk. I watched the phone dance across the wood for 3 rings before I read the text. It didn't say, "We're sorry." It didn't say, "Let's explain why you weren't there." It said, "Your brother is heartbroken you didn't reach out. You've always been the reliable one, Victoria. Don't let a small misunderstanding ruin his special time." I didn't reply. I just leaned back and looked at the coastal fog rolling in. A small misunderstanding was their term for a coordinated, extravagantly funded act of erasure. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family crisis. It was a balance sheet. While I stayed silent, my mother, Jennifer, decided to take her frustration to the public square. She posted a long, rambling status on Facebook about loyalty and ungrateful children who value professional success over blood. She even included a photo from the wedding, the one where Destiny was wearing a $2,500 designer bag. I knew that bag. It was the exact model I'd mentioned wanting 3 months ago. Tyler had clearly used the loan I gave him for his gambling debts to buy it as a wedding gift. This is the trap of normalized cruelty. My family isn't a group of monsters in their own eyes. They are simply people who have spent decades convincing themselves that my function is more important than my personhood. To them, my role is to provide the silent infrastructure, the free management, the emergency loans, the emotional strength. They've built a psychological ecosystem where Tyler's fragility is a sacred priority, and my independence is a personal attack. Jennifer didn't exclude me because she forgot. She excluded me because she had normalized the idea that I didn't need to be there as long as my resources were. In their warped logic, excluding me was a sophisticated choice to avoid drama, but my refusal to congratulate them was the only act of cruelty that counted. To cap it off, my brother, Tyler, finally called. I answered, and there was no apology. No mention of the house he was currently sleeping in that technically belonged to me. Instead, his voice was thick with entitlement. "Listen, Vic," he said, "Destiny and I are launching a boutique design consultancy. We've found the perfect office space in Portland, but the bank is being difficult about our credit history. I need you to sign as a guarantor for a $50,000 business loan. Dad said you'd understand. It's the least you can do after being so distant this week." I stared at the black and white prints of my latest architectural project. The irony was a physical weight. The copycat was finally trying to become the original, and they expected me to pay for the transformation. "The least I can do?" I asked, my voice as cold and flat as the Atlantic. "You've mistaken my silence for a blank check, Tyler, but my compassion has been a luxury you've officially overdrafted." I didn't wait for his reaction. I hung up and went back to my workstation. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and a title audit that was about to turn their perfect day into a very public eviction. The brick buildings of Portland smelled like wood smoke and ancient salt as I walked into the law offices of Sterling and Associates. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. I needed a surveyor's precision. I sat across from Grace, a woman whose reputation for real estate litigation was as sharp as the crease in her charcoal suit. I didn't tell her about the heartbreak or the Facebook photos. I handed her the deed, the trust documents, and the disorganized pile of family limited liability company filings I'd spent all night auditing. My father handled the finalization of the limited liability company. 5 years ago, I told her, my voice as level as a horizon line. Grace adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the documents with the lethal speed of an apex predator. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the flipping of heavy paper and the distant call of a harbor gull. Then she stopped. She looked at a specific page from the state registry, then back at me. A small, cold smile touched her lips. "Victoria," she said, sliding a document across the mahogany desk, "your father didn't handle the finalization. He started the application, but he never filed the operating agreement or the transfer of title. It seems he was too lazy to complete the 3-step authentication process." I stared at the paperwork. My father's laziness had always been a family joke, a quirk my mother would laugh off, while I picked up his slack. Now, it was a legal death sentence for their lifestyle. Because he had never moved the Kennebunkport property into the limited liability company, the title had never technically shifted. When my grandmother's trust triggered, on my 30th birthday, the estate didn't pass to a company controlled by my parents. It passed directly to me. "So, the house?" I asked. "The Kennebunkport estate, the grounds, and every structure on that multi-million-dollar property belongs 100% to you, Victoria," Grace confirmed. "Legally, the family limited liability company is a ghost. It owns nothing." I didn't feel a surge of joy. I felt the click of a lock falling into place. This wasn't a family home anymore. It was an unauthorized occupancy of a primary asset. My brother was sleeping in a guest room I owned. My parents were eating breakfast in a kitchen that was legally mine. They were squatters in tuxedos and white silk. "Draft it," I said, leaning forward. "Draft what?" "A formal legal notice of unauthorized occupancy," I replied, my tone clinical. "Address it to Thomas and Jennifer. Include Tyler and Destiny. I'm giving them exactly 72 hours to vacate voluntarily. If they are still there on hour 73, I will have the sheriff remove them for trespassing." Grace paused, her pen hovering. "You're sure? Once this is served, there is no going back to Sunday dinners." I thought about the wedding photos. I thought about the fragile brother who needed a $50,000 guarantor and the strong daughter who wasn't worth an invitation. "They canceled my membership to the family a long time ago," I said. "I'm just finally sending them the bill for the venue." I signed the engagement letter with a steady hand. The blue ink looked like a vein of ice against the white paper. The professional escalation had begun, and the forecast for Kennebunkport was officially freezing. The air in Grace's office was thick, with the scent of old parchment and the clinical ozone smell of high-end air purifiers. It felt like an operating room where a dead relationship was about to be autopsied. I watched the cursor blink on her secondary monitor, a small, rhythmic pulse that signaled the end of my life as a silent investor in my family's lies. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a forensic audit. Grace turned the screen toward me, her expression as flat and professional as a tombstone. "We found the massive cash inheritance willed to you by your grandmother," she said. This was the one account my parents had insisted on keeping off the company books, claiming it was being managed separately for my protection. I looked at the balance. It was zero. The account had been drained. Over the last 18 months, the funds siphoned in increments of $50,000 into a hidden private trust solely in Tyler's name. Then she opened the digital file of the authorization forms. I leaned in, my glasses catching the blue light of the monitor. At the bottom of each page was a signature. It was my name. It was a digital authorization using my old security credentials, but the IP address traced back to their home, not my office. It was a crude, premeditated forgery of my digital identity. My parents hadn't just treated my compassion as an overdrafted luxury. They had committed a felony to ensure their golden child never had to work a day in his life. "They didn't just stop at the cash," Grace said, her voice dropping an octave, as she handed me a physical folder. Inside was a document labeled Deed of Gift. I read the lines twice to make sure my eyes weren't failing me. Jennifer and Thomas had drafted papers to gift my Kennebunkport home the estate grandmother left specifically to me, to Tyler and Destiny, as a wedding surprise. The clinical evil of it was breathtaking. They had invited 200 guests to watch them give away my property while I sat in my studio alone. They planned to present the keys to a house they didn't own at a reception they banned me from attending. They weren't just erasing me from a photo, they were liquidating my entire existence to fund a fantasy. They intended to leave me homeless while telling me I was too strong to need their support. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just looked at the access logs on the monitor and felt the last tether of blood obligation snap. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was an accounting ledger. My parents weren't family. They were sophisticated debtors who had committed a lethal act of theft. I want a full criminal referral, I said, my voice echoing in the sterile room. The eviction notice for the house is the opening move. I want the police to investigate the forgery and a court order to freeze Tyler's private trust immediately. This wasn't revenge. It was the execution of judgment on a 3-decade-old deficit. The glass door of my design studio didn't just open, it was shoved. My mother, Jennifer, burst into the room, her face a blotchy mask of desperation, her eyes red from a night of crying. She looked out of place in my world, a space defined by symmetry, precision, and high-value contracts. I didn't stand up. I didn't offer her the designer chair. Across from my desk, I simply sat behind my workstation and watched her struggle to breathe, my expression as flat as a marble countertop. Victoria, the bank froze the LLC cards and the stipend accounts. She gasped, her voice shrill, with a panic that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with liquidity. They're talking about Tyler's trust. They're asking about the Kennebunkport transfers. You have to tell them it was a mistake. You have to show us some family mercy. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking in the silence. For 32 years, I had been the silent investor in her version of a family, but the subscription had officially expired. Mercy is a luxury you've officially overdrafted, Jennifer, I said, my voice cold and clinical. We aren't discussing a mistake. We're discussing the forensic evidence of a felony. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a heavy black folder. I didn't toss it. I slid it across the glass surface toward her, with a slow, agonizing precision of a falling axe. What is this? She whispered, her manicured hands trembling as she opened it. That is the 72-hour eviction notice. For the Kennebunkport estate, I replied, each word measured and final. And tucked behind it is the criminal referral for forgery and grand theft. Using my old security credentials for those transfers wasn't a mistake. It was identity theft. The law doesn't care that you're my mother. It cares about the digital trail you left behind. Jennifer collapsed into the chair. She hadn't been invited to sit in, the papers fluttering like white flags. You're taking our home? You're sending your father and brother to prison? How could you do this to your own family? I stood up then, the height of the ceiling, and the cold, blue light of my monitors, framing me in a position of absolute control. I didn't feel a surge of rage. I felt the clean, quiet satisfaction of a balanced ledger. I'm not doing anything to you, I said, leaning over the desk, until our eyes met. I'm simply liquidating a toxic asset. You spent years treating me like I was too strong to need your love, while you stole my inheritance to fund a brother you were too weak to raise. You wanted me to be invisible, Jennifer. You wanted me to be a ghost in the background of your perfect photos. Well, I've decided to grant you that wish. I walked to the door and held it open, the street noise of Portland pouring into the quiet studio. I saved you from a daughter you never wanted anyway. I delivered the final blow. Now, vacate my property. I have a firm to run, and your drama is no longer a bill I'm willing to pay. I watched her walk out, her shoulders slumped, her power gone, while I closed the door and turned back to a life that finally, legally, and entirely belonged to me. The Kennebunkport estate sold for just under $2 million, just as the first frost hit the Maine coast. Combined with the full recovery of my $950,000 inheritance, seized directly from Tyler's hidden accounts, I walked away with nearly $3 million. My parents and Tyler were left with exactly zero. They weren't shocked by what they'd done, they were just shocked that I'd stopped playing along. I didn't stick around to watch them pack. I didn't need the closure of their apologies, because apologies are just bad checks from bankrupt souls. Instead, I opened my own firm, the Shoreline Group. I moved into a sleek penthouse downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over the same ocean that used to feel so cold. Now, the view is different. It's a landscape I designed myself. To those of you listening who feel like the invisible foundation of your own family, the ones always told you are too strong to need help, this is my letter to you. You aren't a resource. You aren't a backup plan. And you certainly aren't the extra in someone else's story. The invisible chains only hold as much power as the silence you provide. Sometimes the most architectural thing you can do is let the structure fall so you can build something that actually belongs to you. I spent 32 years shrinking to fit their shadow. Today, I'm finally taking up all the space I've earned. Inside, my life is no longer a balance sheet of their debts. It's a blueprinted future of my own making. I stared at the numbers one last time, then hit delete. That night, for the first time in my life, I slept through until morning. No guilt, no noise, just the quiet of a life, finally, legally, and entirely mine. If you've ever found the strength to walk away from a gilded cage and build your own empire, hit that like button. Sharing this story helps others find their voice. Thanks for listening.